All right, so we are beginning Unit 3 of the Obedience of Faith. And Unit 3 is Commendation from God, Part 1, Kings. So, commendation means those who are commended by God, those whom God sees as worthy of reward or even praise, to be told, well done, good and faithful servant. So, our life's goal and objective should be to hear those very words. When we stand before Jesus, we want to be commended by God. And so the next 2 units, we're going to be looking at people who received a commendation from God and those who did not, and some of the reasons why. So this unit is going to be focused on kings, and the next unit we're going to dig into Hebrews chapter 11, which is where the expression commendation from God comes from, because the writer of Hebrews says that those people received their commendation from God. Well, the opening verse in this unit is 2 Chronicles 16, verse 9. We're going to read from the NIV translation. For the eyes of the Lord range throughout the earth to strengthen those whose hearts are fully committed to Him. So the question is your heart fully committed to Him? He's looking to give strong support to those whose heart is fully committed to Him. He will give you strong support if you are in it for His purposes and His plans. But if you're out there doing your own thing, then God won't necessarily give you strong support. He'll never leave you. He'll never forsake you. He's a good God. He's not quick to wrath, but He's looking to give strong support to those who truly worship and those who truly rely on Him. So part A of Unit 3 is Kingdom of Priests and Rules for Kings. So we're going to resume looking at the story of Israel, and I want to set this up for you. So remember, we talked about in a prior unit how God's original purpose for Israel and His design was that God would be king over Israel. God was king, not a human king. That was His original design, for them to be a holy nation and a kingdom of priests. So let's just set the baseline. That was God's design. He told them that as soon as they came out of Egypt and were born as a nation. However, God foresaw that the day would come when they would demand a human king. And we talked about that a little bit already in Unit 2. But God gave in the law of Moses, about 400 years before Israel demanded a king, God said, you know what? The days are coming when you're going to demand a king. So here are the rules according to the law for when you do have a king and how that king is supposed to conduct himself. See, God is all-knowing. He's omniscient. 400 years before Israel did this, He already laid down the laws for kings. We can find these in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 17, starting with verse 14. When you come to the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and possess it and dwell in it, and then say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me. So you see, God already knew that Israel was going to do this. We're at verse 15. You may indeed set a king over you, whom the Lord your God will choose. So that's requirement number 1. The Lord has to choose the king. Not just anyone. It is not a democracy. It is still a monarchy. God is still king. But if you want a human king, then God the king will be the one who chooses your human king. Now, another requirement. It must be one from among your brothers. You shall set as king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you who is not your brother. So the king must be an Israelite. It goes on, more requirements. Only he must not acquire many horses for himself, or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never return that way again. So horses in that day were a sign of military strength. So the Lord is saying, don't acquire too much military strength. Why? Because He wants His people to depend on Him. And we're going to look at battles and how God doesn't want people relying on human strength and ability, or military strength and ability, or military alliances with other nations. So in that day, it was horses. Today, it would be weapons and tanks and airplanes and ships and all of this. He's saying don't acquire too many horses for military might. And don't go down to Egypt. Egypt was the land of your slavery. Egypt is represented representative of the world and the pattern of this world. When I redeemed you out of there, I said you're not going back there. So don't go back to Egypt and don't try to become like Egypt in military might. Remember, Egypt was the most powerful army in the world in the days that God is speaking this. But he goes on with requirements for kings. We're at verse 17. And he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away. So wives, women, if they're not godly women, can turn a man's heart away from the things that he should be devoted to. And also, wives, having many wives was a sign of prosperity in that time in many, many cultures. And so God's people were supposed to be holy and set apart, not like the rest of the nations of the world. So he's saying, don't acquire too many wives for himself, so that his heart is not turned away. He goes on, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. So wealth is kind of like the same idea as military strength. Not too many horses, not too much money. Money could turn the king's heart away from relying on God and seeing God as his provider and as the provider for the people. And also, if the king has too much money, the king could lose touch with the reality of life of the common people and would lose touch with the outcry of the poor. The king is there to administer justice for the poor and justice for all the people, not to show partiality to the rich, but he needs to have compassion and understanding of the reality of life for the common people. And if he is too wealthy, he's going to lose his grip on reality. The ultimate modern day example of that is Marie Antoinette. Oh, let them eat cake. Totally disconnected from the reality of the poor in her own nation. Well, just let them eat cake. I mean, isn't there enough cake to go around for everyone? So you get the idea. We're at verse 18. And when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law, approved by the Levitical priests. And it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life. Okay, so first of all, he has to write a copy of the law. And Moses is most likely referring to the book of Deuteronomy, which is a recap of the law, but he could be referring to the entire Torah, which would be the first 5 books of the Bible. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That would be the Torah, the law of God, the instruction of God. So the king would write that out by his own hand and read it every day of his life, meditate on it every day of his life. And it goes on to say, so that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by keeping all the words of this law and these statutes and doing them. So you read it all the time, so you learn it, so that you fear the Lord, and so that you do it. And here we go with another so that. So write out a copy of the book of the law so that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers. So that's very similar to not having too much silver and gold so that you lose touch with the reality of the common people, but so that the law will keep you humble, so that you don't get wise in your own sight, so that you don't think that you are God, so that you don't start lording over other people, that you recognize, if you are the king of Israel, that you also are a man under authority, meaning under the authority of God. You are under the authority of the word of God, the law of God, and if you meditate on it day and night, then you will remain humble, so that your heart is not lifted up above other people. We've got one more so that. So make a copy of the book of the law, meditate on it day and night, so that you may not turn aside from the commandment, either to the right hand or to the left, so that he may continue long in his kingdom, he and his children in Israel. So God's desire is for them to last a long time, live a long time, and be his representatives in the earth. But the only way they're going to do that, especially after they appoint a human king, is if the king is extremely serious about fearing the Lord, worshiping the Lord, and obeying the commandments of the Lord. If they do that, then everything will go well for them. Well, we're going to take a look at the example of the book of Joshua. Now, Joshua was not the king of Israel, but he was the first leader that was appointed over the people of Israel after Moses went to be with the Lord. And the book of Joshua gives us the example. Now, there are 2 major major battles in the book of Joshua. And then the rest of the battles that go on for the rest of the book of Joshua, we can assume that Israel was obedient because of what they learned from the two battles that are covered in detail. So the two battles that are covered in detail are the Battle of Jericho and the Battle of Ai. Well, those battles give us the understanding of how God works and how God gives victory. So the rest of the battles in the entire book of Joshua are not covered in detail, only those two. Well, when Joshua succeeded Moses as the leader of Israel, God's instructions to Joshua for how to be a successful leader were very clear. Let's look at Joshua chapter 1, starting with verse 7. God says to Joshua, "Only be strong and very courageous, being careful to do according to all the law that Moses, my servant, commanded you." That sounds a lot like Deuteronomy 17 that we just read as the rules for kings. He says, "Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left, that you may have good success wherever you go." So he's saying, this law, if you keep my law and do not turn from it, I will prosper you. We're at verse 8. "This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth. You shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do according to all that is written in it." So you see how this is almost exactly what Deuteronomy 17 said as the rules for kings over Israel. God continues to Joshua, "For then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have good success." So God is saying the same thing to Joshua, even though he wasn't king over Israel. He said, if you meditate on the law day and night, and you do everything in it, then you will have victory. You will have success. So also the Ark of the Covenant, the covenant between God and Israel, and the ark that had been made to house the presence and the majesty of God, and the covenant between God and Israel, that Ark of the Covenant was absolutely central in Joshua's leadership of the people. They revered the presence of God with them, and they followed behind God's leading. They didn't carry the Ark of God on a cart behind them saying, "Come on, God, get on our path." No, God went before them, and the people followed after him in holy reverence and fear for his mighty presence dwelling among them. This is Joshua 3, starting with verse 1. "Then Joshua rose early in the morning, and they set out from Shittim. And they came to the Jordan, he and all the people of Israel, and lodged there before they passed over. At the end of 3 days, the officers went through the camp and commanded the people, 'As soon as you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God being carried by the Levitical priests, then you shall set out from your place and follow it. Yet there shall be a distance between you and it, about 2,000 cubits in length.'" So they're saying you have to stay 3,000 feet behind where the Ark of the Covenant is. So 2,000 cubits, a cubit is about 18 inches. So that's about 3,000 feet. So he's saying, do not come near it, in order that you may know the way you shall go, for you have not passed this way before. So he's saying, we're following behind the Ark of the Covenant. We don't really know where we're going. We need God to lead us by his presence to the place that he wants us to go, to the place that he has prepared for us. And we, in holy awe and reverence, stay back from where the presence of God is. And he goes on to command the people to consecrate themselves to the Lord, to be clean, to be a holy people entering into their first battles in the Promised Land. But the Ark of the Covenant was absolutely central to Joshua's leadership of the people. Well, also, before Joshua led the people into their first battle, which was the Battle of Jericho, he had an encounter with the commander of the Lord's army. This is a very powerful encounter that he has, and it gives us good insight into how God works in bringing about victory. Many people say, "God, I want to see how you see." This is going to give you insight into seeing how God sees. Joshua 5, starting with verse 13. "When Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing before him with his drawn sword in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, 'Are you for us or for our adversaries?' And he said, 'No, but I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come.'" So let me break this down for you. Joshua, he sees this terrifying figure with a sword drawn, and he says, "Hold up, are you on our side or are you on the side of our enemies? I need to know because you look like you could really kick some butt." And the man that he sees with the drawn sword says, "Nope, that's not how it works. I'm the commander of the army of the Lord. I'm not for you or against you. I'm not for them or against them. I am for the Lord. So anyone who aligns themselves with the Lord, I'm for them. Anyone who disobeys the Lord or is not aligned with the Lord, I'm against them." Do you get it? I'm not for you or against you. I am for the Lord. If you're for the Lord, I'm for you. If you're not for the Lord, I'm not for you. That's how the commander of the army of the Lord works. And Joshua, he falls on his face and he says, "What does my Lord say to his servant?" And the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, "Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so. So that's almost verbatim the same thing that the angel of the Lord said to Moses at the burning bush incident. We don't have time to pull out all the parallels there, but I just want you to make note of it. This is a commission from the commander of the Lord's army saying to Joshua, "I'm commissioning you just like I commissioned Moses. And if you are for the Lord, I will be for you. If you are not for the Lord, then I will be against you." So now let's go into the battles of Jericho and Ai. Remember, these are representations of how Israel will succeed or fail in attaining victory over their enemies. And this goes on. This is the baseline for so much of what we're going to cover in this unit about how God gives victory or failure, destruction, oppression. The enemy gets victory. So it's all based on, guess what? The obedience of faith. Well, Jericho was a victory. The people obeyed God's instructions, and God gave them victory over Jericho in an absolutely supernatural way that human beings could not bring about on their own. And the story of the Battle of Jericho may be familiar to you, that the walls came tumbling down after the people had marched around the city for 7 days and blew the trumpets and shouted with a great shout. We're not going to go into those elements of the story because you probably know those parts already. We're going to look at different elements of it. So it was God's command that Jericho be destroyed completely. It was devoted to destruction. Let's pick up at Joshua 6, starting with verse 17. "And the city and all that is within it shall be devoted to the Lord for destruction. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall live, because she hid the messengers whom we sent. But you, keep yourselves from the things devoted to destruction, lest when you have devoted them, you take any of the devoted things and make the camp of Israel a thing for destruction and bring trouble upon it." So the Lord is saying, the whole city and everything in it must be destroyed. And he's saying, be careful. You have to keep yourselves. If you see the stuff in the city and you want any of it for yourself, don't be tempted by that. You have to keep yourself. You have to have self-control and not take the things that are devoted to destruction. If the people of Israel take things for themselves that are supposed to be devoted to destruction, then they will bring trouble upon Israel. Well, so they go into battle. We'll pick up at Joshua 6, verse 20. "So the people shouted, and the trumpets were blown. And as soon as the people heard the sound of the trumpet, the people shouted with a great shout, and the wall fell down flat, so that the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they captured the city. Then they devoted all in the city to destruction, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, and donkeys, with the edge of the sword. So they went in and they obeyed the Lord and devoted the city to destruction. But we find out later that they did what they were not supposed to do. And it was only one man who did it, not many, just one. And that was enough to pollute the people of Israel with disobedience. Joshua 7, verse 1. But the people of Israel broke faith in regard to the devoted things. For Achan, the son of Carmi, son of Zabdi, son of Zerah of the tribe of Judah, took some of the devoted things, and the anger of the Lord burned against the people of Israel. So we, the reader, already know that this has happened. But Joshua and the people of Israel, they don't know that this has happened. They have just experienced a great victory. They have just seen the glory of God and the power of of God bring down the city walls of Jericho and give them victory over this city. So they are jubilant and rejoicing, but they don't yet know that this disobedience has been committed. Well, they're feeling a little full of themselves, and they have their next battle to go into, which is the Battle of Ai. Well, Ai was a much smaller city than Jericho, so Joshua sent in only 3,000 men. Well, take note, they did not have a command from God to do this. They only had the council of spies that they had sent in to the city of Ai. So why am I saying that? Because that demonstrates self-reliance, relying on yourself and thinking, it's easy to take a city. Look, we just took Jericho and the walls came down. We're the people of God. It's easy to do it. Let's just send in 3,000 men. We don't need to send in our whole army. We've got this. Self-reliance. What did we open this unit with? God will give strong support to those who rely on him. And also, secondly, the council of spies, that is not obeying a command or the counsel of God. There's a difference in relying on God and obeying God and taking the counsel of spies, taking the counsel of men who say, hey, this is what it looks like to us. This is the wisdom that we have. That's never going to compare to the wisdom of God. Well, let's take a look. They go into the city of Ai, Joshua 7, starting with verse 4. So about 3,000 men went up there from the people, and they fled before the men of Ai. And the men of Ai killed about 36 of their men and chased them before the gate as far as Shebarim and struck them at the descent. And the hearts of the people melted and became as water. So Israel was defeated by a relatively small enemy. Even after their great victory at Jericho, they became self-reliant, they took man's counsel rather than God's, and they were defeated, embarrassingly so, by a relatively small army from a small city. So, what does Joshua do with the elders of Israel? We'll pick up at verse 6. Then Joshua tore his clothes and fell to the earth on his face before the ark of the Lord until the evening, he and the elders of Israel. And they put dust on their heads. And Joshua said, Alas, O Lord God, why have you brought this people over the Jordan at all, to give us into the hands of the Amorites to destroy us? Would that we had been content to dwell beyond the Jordan. O Lord, what can I say when Israel has turned their backs before their enemies? So Joshua is forlorn. He is dismayed. He's saying, we just got our butts kicked by our enemies. God, what are we even doing in this land of giants if we're not going to win these battles? We just got defeated by a relatively small army from a small city. He's saying, God, what is happening? And to Joshua's credit, at least he's on his face before the Lord and seeking the counsel of the Lord. Well, we'll pick up at verse 10. The Lord said to Joshua, Get up! Why have you fallen on your face? Israel has sinned. They have transgressed my covenant that I commanded them. They have taken some of the devoted things. They have stolen and lied and put them among their own belongings. Therefore, the people of Israel cannot stand before their enemies. What have we already discovered? Whenever there's a therefore, we have to discover what it's there for. He's saying, you've disobeyed, therefore you're being defeated by your enemies. They turn their backs before their enemies because they have become devoted for destruction. I will be with you no more unless you destroy the devoted things from among you. Remember, this is what the commander of the army said. The commander of the Lord's army said, if you're for the Lord, if you obey the Lord, then I'll be for you. But if you're not obeying the Lord, then I'll be against you, and you'll be devoted to destruction. So unless you repent and come into obedience, then you will be devoted to destruction. He goes on, he says, Get up, consecrate the people, and say, Consecrate yourselves for tomorrow. Thus says the Lord, God of Israel, there are devoted things in your midst, O Israel. You cannot stand before your enemies until you take away the devoted things from among you. So when Israel disobeyed God, they were unable to stand before their enemies. And the story goes on that God, by casting lots, narrows it down and down and down and down until they find Achan, that it was Achan who took some of the devoted things and hid them in his tent. And so once Achan was identified, Israel stoned Achan to death and all his family with stones, and a big heap of stones was on top of him. So then, once he had been destroyed and the devoted things had been devoted to destruction in accordance with the command of God, then God gave a command to go in and take Ai. So this would be the city of Ai, take 2. But this now is at the command of God. So the Lord says, this is now Joshua 8, verse 1, and the Lord said to Joshua, do not fear and do not be dismayed. Take all the fighting men with you. So notice, not just 3,000, take all the fighting men with you. That's the command of the Lord for the battle of Ai. Do not fear, do not be dismayed. Take all the fighting men with you and arise, go up to Ai. See, I have given into your hand the king of Ai, and his people, his city, and his land. And you shall do to Ai and its king as you did to Jericho and its king. So God is giving his instruction. He's saying, go in and do to Ai what you did to Jericho. Now I have given you the city of Ai. Before you tried to take it on your own, it didn't go well. Now I am giving it to you, and I have given you the command. So this is the basis and the foundation for how Israel will have victory or defeat in all of their battles. If they are aligned with God and obeying him, God will give victory. If they're worshiping God and relying on him, God will give victory. If they're doing it in their own strength, in their own idea, in the counsel of men, or aligning themselves with others, then God will allow them to be defeated by their enemies. This is the basis for how it works, and that's exactly what the commander of the Lord's army said. All right, so we're going to move into point B of Unit 3, which is demanding a human king. And I know we talked about this a little bit in Unit 2, but I want to bring you back into the narrative after Joshua's generation. Remember, Israel having a human king was a modification from God's original design, but that didn't stop Israel from demanding a king. And we're just going to refresh our memories of how this all came about. So, after Joshua's generation, Israel was under the care of elders and judges, but Israel fell away from the Lord and from his word, from his commandments, from his law. So let's look at Judges chapter 2, starting with verse 11, which gives a recap of what happened in the people's times of devotion and times of rebellion, and what would happen to them as they went along in this way. So Judges 2, verse 11, and the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. And they abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They went after other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were around them and bowed down to them. And they provoked the Lord to anger. They abandoned the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to plunderers who plundered them. So you see, we talked about this with Romans 1. God gave them up. God gave them up. God gave them up. So here, Israel, they're serving other gods. And so God is like, okay, I'll give you up. You want to serve the gods of the nations? Then I will let you serve the gods of the nations by being plundered by the people who serve those gods. I'll give you up to your plunderers. You want to serve their gods? I will give you up to their gods if that's what you want. And so he goes on, and he sold them into the hand of their surrounding enemies so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. Now, what did we just read from the book of Joshua? You cannot stand before your enemies because you have taken some of the devoted things. He's saying here, because Israel had turned their hearts away from God, that's why they could no longer withstand their enemies. You're putting the pieces together. Here's how it all fits. We're at verse 15. Whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them for harm, as the Lord had warned, and as the Lord had sworn to them, and they were in terrible distress. So, same thing, commander of the Lord's army. If you're for the Lord, I am for you. If you're against the Lord, I'm against you. This is playing out through the course of the history of Israel. Israel. And because they abandoned God through sin and rebellion and worshiping other gods and not keeping the laws of God, God abandoned them to their enemies, and they could not stand in battle. God was now not fighting for them, but God was fighting against them. But out of pity and mercy for his people, God would raise up judges to deliver them from their enemies. And he would give strength to the judge, and the people would follow the judge for a while. But then after the judge died, the people went right back to their rebellion against God and not keeping the laws of God. So let's look at the recap of this. Judges 2, starting with verse 16. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hand of those who plundered them. Yet they did not listen to their judges, for they whored after other gods and bowed down to them. We covered that in Unit 2. They became whores rather than being a bride. They soon turned aside from the way in which their fathers had walked, who had obeyed the commandments of the Lord, and they did not do so. Whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge and saved them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning because of those who afflicted and oppressed them. So the Lord is merciful. This is like when your own child does something horribly wrong and you have to punish them, but then you are so moved in your heart that you find a way to help them get out of the mess that they themselves have gotten themselves into. The Lord was moved to pity. Yes, he was right in allowing their enemies to plunder them. Yes, he was right in allowing them to be turned over to their own evil choices. But he was moved to pity that their own evil choices had wound them up in such a mess. And even though they had done it to themselves, God wanted to help them get out of the mess. We're at verse 19. But whenever the judge died, they turned back and were more corrupt than their fathers, going after other gods, serving them and bowing down to them. They did not drop any of their practices or their stubborn ways. So this was the time in Israel's history, we talked about this before, that everyone did what was right in their own sight. Everyone basically positioned themselves as their own God to do whatever was right in their own sight. And Israel proceeded to decline in behavior and become more and more and more corrupt until there's the story that we talked about before at the end of the book of Judges, where the behavior of the Israelites was like an instant replay of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, as corrupt as it can possibly get. Well, Israel then demanded a human king so that they could be like all the other nations, and God gave them their request. We covered that in Unit 2, but let's look at another aspect of it. So before Samuel died, remember, Samuel was a judge, he was a prophet, and he was an honorable man, but his sons didn't walk in his ways. So that's another reason why Israel wanted a king to be appointed before Samuel died. So before Samuel died, he appointed Saul. Saul was one that God had revealed to him. Saul had been selected by God, and Samuel anointed Saul to be Israel's first king. And then Samuel proceeded to give a farewell address to Israel. And in this farewell address, Samuel gave a recap of Israel's history and its leaders since the time they came out of Egypt and all the way through the possession of the promised land and the victories of the judges God had appointed to deliver them and rule over them. Well, Samuel also highlighted how faithful God had been to Israel and how rebellious Israel had been against God. And he also discussed how God had proved mighty on Israel's behalf whenever they cried out to him for deliverance. See, when their eyes were on other gods, God did not help them. But when their eyes were on God and they cried out to God for assistance, God heard their cries and God moved mightily on their behalf. God is looking in all the earth for one that he can show himself mighty when they are relying on him. Well, God had delivered Israel repeatedly from many, many powerful enemies that were bigger and taller and stronger than Israel. But when you've got the right God, the maker of heaven and earth on your side, nothing can defeat you. And Samuel was giving Israel a recap of all of these events. And that's in 1 Samuel 12. Well, we're going to pick up at 1 Samuel 12, verse 12, but Samuel makes it clear here that the reason that the people wanted a king and the urgency that came with, we want a king and we want a king now, is because they were under attack from a foreign invader. And remember, the promised land is the land of giants, people who are 13 feet tall. These are giants. The Israelites look like grasshoppers in front of them. And so they see another foreign king is trying to invade, and they're terrified, and they don't want to trust God to give them victory. They want a king to lead them into battle, to give them military strength. Let's look 1 Samuel chapter 12, starting with verse 12. And when you saw that Nahash, the king of the Ammonites, came against you, then you said to me, no, but a king shall reign over us, when the Lord your God was your king. So you had God as king, but you see this enemy and you say, we don't want God as king, we want a human king. We're at verse 13. And now, behold, the king whom you have chosen, for whom you have asked, behold, the Lord has set a king over you. And I imagine he must be pointing to Saul in this moment, saying, look at Saul. And ironically, Saul was the tallest man in all of Israel. The scripture says he was a head taller than everyone else. So they asked for a king to go into battle against these really tall giant people. Well, the king that gets appointed for them, he's the tallest Israelite around. Okay, probably still a lot shorter than any of the giants, but hey, you want a king that fits your model of what you think you need? I'll appoint the tallest man over you. We're at verse 14. If you will fear the Lord and serve him and obey his voice and not rebel against the commandment of the Lord, and if both you and the king who reigns over you will follow the Lord your God, it will be well. So he's saying, if you obey God, and if your king obeys God, then God will give you victory. The rules haven't changed. The principles of battle haven't changed. Verse 15, but if you will not obey the voice of the Lord, but rebel against the commandment of the Lord, then the hand of the Lord will be against you and your king. So the point comes back to, if you obey, God will be for you. It will go well. If you don't obey, God will not be for you. It will not go well. There you have it. It's just what it is. Now, if you have a king, if you don't have a king, so it still depends on how is the king going to lead you in obeying the Lord. If you obey the Lord, it will go well. If you don't, then it won't. Very simple. Well, Samuel then proceeded to write down the duties and the rights of the king, and he wrote them down in a book and laid it before the Lord. And then Samuel sent the people away. And that's the end of this scene. Well, in all of this, you can see that Israel's focus for victory shifted from God to human leadership. So rather than obedience to God, repenting from sin, remaining as a holy people, remaining consecrated, doing the things that God instructs and commands, that would be what would lead to victory. Instead, their eyes aren't on that at all. Now it's like, nope, our king, he's going to lead us into victory. He's going to be responsible for victory. And you see that they are settling for second best to having God as king, and their hearts have shifted away from him. Well, God granted their request, but the principles of battle remain the same. So now, as we look and as we start to go into the kings of Israel, the only hope for Israel, the only hope was that they would have a king over them that would lead them into the obedience of faith by worshiping God with all his heart, by meditating on the law of God day and night, by enforcing the law of God among the people in all their ways with no partiality, accepting no bribes, and purging evil from Israel so that God could bless his people and give them victory over all their enemies. That was the only hope for Israel now that they had a king appointed over them rather than God as their king.